Welcome, everyone, to AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connect's recurring online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota in sponsorship from Bremer Bank and Avisen Legal. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve the competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through the ongoing purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and to increase knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. The Connects program meets the AURI mission to accelerate the expansion of the agricultural economy by empowering expanded uses and markets of agriculturally derived products. Now remember, this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. You'll be muted during our presentations, but you can send us your written questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. Today, we begin a four-part series on climate change opportunities for value-added agricultural businesses. Moderating our discussion today will be Michael Sparby, Commercialization Director for AURI, where he's responsible for developing projects, securing grant funding, assisting in the program delivery, overseeing the annual AURI stakeholder analysis process, and is responsible for AURI's Cooperative Development Center through USDA's Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program. Over his more than 20 years at AURI, Mike has identified many opportunities to develop and commercialize value-added agricultural products throughout Minnesota. Also joining us today will be Peter Boulay from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. He joined the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Minnesota State Climatology Office in 1998. He acts as an operational climatologist and handles many of the data requests that arrive at their office. Pete also is the statewide coordinator of various volunteer rain gauge networks in Minnesota. While in college, he provided radio and agricultural forecasts for Weather Eye Incorporated. And after college, he worked at Cavoris, providing forecasts around the world, including obscure places like Easter Island. He still keeps a weather log for watching the weather, and he admits to taking too many photos of clouds. Then we'll hear from Katie Wiltz-Johnson, an extension economist at the Center for Farm Financial Management in the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota. Katie assists farmers in increasing their farm profitability through outstanding farm management practices. She grew up on a crop farm in western Minnesota and is still actively involved in farming. Katie and her husband are dairy farmers. Our third presenter today will be Ariel Kagan, Director of Climate and Working Lands for the Minnesota Farmers Union. Ariel joined the MFU team as the Climate and Working Lands Program Director in February of 2023. Her background is in agricultural economics and policy, and she has worked across sectors to support farmers, climate resilience, and policy development. At Farmers Union, she works on topics related to climate-smart agriculture, renewable energy, market development, and environmental policy. So let's circle back to AURI's Michael Sparby to set the stage for today's program, part one in a four-part series. Michael Sparby, welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you, Dan. So when we put together this four-part series, we're looking at the changing climate and the impacts on value-added agriculture and what areas of opportunities exist. So what we're going to do today is, with this series, we wanted to provide an overview on the first part to lay the groundwork and then move to the topics of carbon, water, and nitrogen. So today we're going to hear from Pete Boulay, who will be setting the stage as to where the climate has been in Minnesota and where we're at now. Next, we'll hear from Katie Wiltz-Johnson on linking the changing climate to the agricultural economy and the impact producers' decisions are making. Finally, we'll be hearing from Ariel Kagan, who will be providing information on resources and areas of opportunity for value-added agriculture. So I will turn things over to Pete.
Well, thank you, Michael, and happy to be here today, talk a little bit about weather, past, present, and future. Start out with a slide of some soggy soybeans this year. It's kind of been the theme this summer. We were in a recent drought, and it shows how quickly things can turn. Next slide. Probably the one thing to remember is we've had this website for a long time. As you could tell, it looks like it's from the 1990s, and our goal is to put as much information as we can packing on a website. We have all kinds of agricultural type of weather data on there. Next slide, you can see it. Here's where our agricultural and horticultural decision support tools are, and we're always adding more products to this page. And literally right now I have a student worker working on new products for our website even today. So next slide. A little general information, what I'll talk about today, kind of like our recent pattern we've been in. Basically, we were really wet, and then we had a 3-year drought, 4-year if you're including the transition year, and now we're back to wet. A little bit about climate trends, what's going on right now, and what does the future hold? Next slide. So where have we been? If you remember this far back, the very wet 2010s in southern Minnesota especially. From 2010 to 2019, it was the wettest decade on record for the state. And so during that decade, much of southern and eastern Minnesota had 40 to 65 inches of surplus moisture. It's like getting another year to a year and a half extra moisture within these 10-year span. And so what happened was people were really getting used to the wetness. And one thing I want to point out too on this map is it's a big state, and precipitation can vary widely across the state. Next slide. Then what happened? Beginning in the 2020s, actually 2020 was already dry, and we had 4 years in a row, basically below normal precipitation. So these droughts came in waves. Every year we had a different peak. 2021 August, and 2022 was in November, and in 2023 was during September. Next slide, you can see that not everybody was in the extreme drought. The little area in Sibley County and Nicollet County didn't do as bad as others, but you could tell the drought was felt by just about everybody in the state. Next slide. We had a remarkable recovery this year. You never know when a drought is going to be broken, but history has shown is when they do break, they break in spectacular fashion. We saw that with the 1976 drought. 1977 was one of the wettest years on record. The 1987 through 89 drought, the early 1990s were very wet. This is what happened again in 2024. We did better than normal across the state, beginning in the spring and right up into the summer. Next slide. One of the best things we use in our office to keep tabs on soil moisture is there's only one spot left in the state that does gravimetric weighing soil to see how much water's in it, and that's in Lamberton at the Southwest Regional Center at the U of M. And you can see when the droughts peak, basically last year it was peaking in September and into October, and we had pretty good recovery at the end of the year. Next slide. And you can see in 2024, we had record soil moisture in not only in Lamberton, but across much of southern Minnesota, very wet soils. And you could basically see when the crops started drawing the moisture on the last point in August 1st, it went down, but that's still very high for this time of year. We're in the grand consumption stage right now where the crops are drawing moisture, and you can see that average line begins to go down. Where we're headed from this, I'd love to know that myself. So we'll walk through things and see what could happen. Next slide. Going over a few trends over time, we've been keeping an eye on this for a very long time here in our office. And basically, the total temperature change since 1895, we're seeing a northward extent of where it is the warmest. And really what we're looking at, the majority of the warming is taking place in the winter and especially overnight. And the total temperature change, look at those winter lows in the middle there since 1895 to 2021. It's been warming the fastest, especially in the north, but everywhere in the state's been warming up quite a bit in the winter. One thing that stands out is summer highs haven't necessarily warmed in the southern part of the state. Part of that is because it's been really wet. That's another trend we're seeing is wetter conditions. Next slide. So people ask, well, what is this bias for the Twin Cities or something like that? And then we like to pick this spot. This is Milan in Chippewa County. Same family for 125 years. They've used the same equipment the whole time. Next slide with a picture of their farm. And there's the station there, and there's no heat island in Milan. So this is a great place to see weather trends over time. Next slide. You can see what's been going on there, going all the way back to 1895. And over time, we've seen the average coldest temperature seen in the winter going up over time. It wasn't that uncommon in Milan to get down to minus 35 below zero in the winter, and even once in a blue moon, they hit minus 40. But now Milan's struggling to even get to minus 30. And that has implications on killing winter pests. The warmer it stays during the winter, the better pests can overwinter, survive in the soil, and then reemerge in the next year. Next slide. Now that we're seeing that is we're seeing an expanded freeze-free characteristics in Milan too. The average number of days staying above freezing per year has been going up over time. This also has implications in agriculture too. Next slide. So what we're seeing there is an expanding growing season in Milan. So your great-grandparents had about 125 days of a growing season in Milan, and now they're up to almost 150. So that has implications on basically what you can plant. If the growing season's longer, you can have a longer growing season corn or something like that. So there is definitely some benefits to a longer growing season too. Next slide. The other problem losing extreme winter cold, and that's the pests can survive. And this is one we've been watching a while here. The Japanese beetles arrived in Minnesota in 1968. And really, they weren't a huge problem in the state until maybe in the last 20 years. I gave a talk, an agricultural, more of a master gardener talk in Chisago County in the early 2000s. I showed a picture of a Japanese beetle. Nobody in the room knew what it was. I gave the same talk about 10, 15 years later, and then a lot of the hands went up. So next slide, you can see how this has been going on. The spread of Japanese beetles, this is what they looked like in 2009. And then the next slide is showing how much they've spread in 2023. So basically, they've been spreading northward across the state, but also expanding elsewhere too. This is just one of things that something you need to consider now in the future that maybe wasn't a problem in the past, but with the changing climate, it's something you got to think about now. Another slide, something else we've been keeping track of is, what really impacts corn yield. And this is an old chart, but I still like it. We still try to keep it up to date. We're still not too far off that trend line for corn yield every year in the state. Doesn't include preventive planning or something like that. But what really stands out is not only do the drought years cause a dip, but as big of a magnitude as really, really wet years. Some folks might remember 1993, not only in Minnesota, but also in Iowa and other states as well. Extremely wet conditions, and that really impacted the yield there too. And 1976, we had a series of dry years as well. So dry and wet years can impact yields quite a bit, but it's something to keep track of. Next slide. So what about the future? Next slide. So everybody always asks, what's the winter going to be like? So I got to get that out of the way first. So what's going to happen this winter? Everybody wants to know. And La Nina is coming back. We had El Nino for the last couple of years, and we really didn't have a winter this past year. The winter of 23-24 took a break. Really wasn't much of a winter at all. And I can almost safely say we will probably not have a repeat this year. That winter was so warm and lack of snow. It'd be hard to duplicate that. So with La Nina coming back, chances are maybe a little bit colder, a little bit of a wetter winter with that jet stream now pulling in more cold air out of the northwest. We'll see what happens. Best chance for real winter coming up is usually late in the season. We're thinking later January into February. So I'll have to wait and see there. Next slide. The Climate Prediction Center outlook for this winter. You can see a little bit of that tug of below normal temperatures and then some above normal precip. But where it says equal chances, that's pretty much a three-sided coin. So we'll see. How about looking into the distant future? Let's go to the next slide, 2041 through 2070. So pretty much more precipitation and more heavy precipitation projected. Basically the same kind of trend we're seeing now over time. We're seeing basically wetter years, including in the winter too. And the top 2% of all rainfalls each year are tending to go up. And so what's happening is that trend is expected to continue for basically a good chunk of the 21st century. Final slide. So in summary, the 2010s, extremely wet period. And just as we got comfortable with that wet period, here comes the droughts. So we had droughts for basically 4 years in Minnesota, and then we had a big turnaround in 2024. So one big news is we have a transition to a La Nina is underway, and a pretty good chance, 74% chance coming this winter. But even though the trend is for a warmer and wetter climate, the bottom line is always expect variability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pete. That was extremely informative. Next, we are going to move on to Katie Welch-Johnson, and she's going to be providing information on the changing climate and the impact on producers. I'll hand it over to you, Katie.
Great, thank you, Michael. So as you know, Dan said in my introduction and Michael said earlier, I am an economist with the Center for Farm Financial Management out of the University of Minnesota. And this is our mission statement right here. And I just wanted to point out, really our mission is to improve farmers' financial management and marketing abilities. And we do this through creating a lot of like educational tools, software, websites, and stuff like that to really help farmers improve their financial management and their marketing abilities. A huge way that we also do this is working with farm business management programs throughout many states of the US. We work very, very closely, especially here in Minnesota, with farm business management programs. Just a little background on what those programs are. Essentially, there is a farm management educator or instructor who goes out and meets one-on-one with farmers who are enrolled in these programs. And the instructor really helps the farmer walk through, where are you at financially right now? Where do you maybe want to be? What practices are you wanting to incorporate into your farm? What expansions are you looking at doing? And here are the options to help you get to where you want to be. We've been working with these farm management programs for over 30 years at the Center for Farm Financial Management. But really within the last couple of years, we've started to take on, in addition to the normal work that we do with those programs, we've started to take on a focus of into this climate smart world and really figuring out or trying to get at what are the financial implications of climate smart practices. I think there's a lot of research out there for farms related to like the agronomic impacts of practices like reduced tillage or cover crops, but there's really a lot of question marks and not very much data available when looking at the financial impacts of some of those climate smart practices. And so that's really a realm that we've entered into in the last handful of years. I'm not going to dive deep into our findings so far into that, but that's kind of the focus and the lens that I'm coming at this morning. So I wanted to really hit on what are the decisions that farmers are having to make, especially related to climate. And to do that, I just wanted to give also a brief overview of like the fact that farmers are having to make hundreds of decisions every day. I think if we're not super closely tied to production agriculture, it's really easy to think that like, oh, a farmer plants a seed in the spring and it magically is grown and ready to be harvested in the fall. And all of a sudden we have food to eat. But there's really a ton that goes into this farming decision. So farms make lots of decisions, anywhere from pre-planting decisions, so getting ready to plant their crops. So, doing tillage, what fertilizer am I going to use? What seeds am I going to plant? Am I going to have crop insurance? At what level, etc. So lots of like pre-planting decisions, and then many decisions during the growing season as well. So how am I going to be planting? Am I, more of an organic operation, or do I have chemicals that I'm going to be spraying? And then marketing is a huge piece too, because that's really a huge factor on the profitability side. How am I going to market my crops? What is my cost of production, of producing those crops, so that I know what price I need to sell my produce at? And then harvesting decisions, so like combining and harvesting and all of that stuff. You'll see on the right-hand side, tillage and fertilizer are kind of a harvest decision, but I also talked about those in the pre-planting decision. So already at harvest time, farmers are having to prep for the next crop, the following growing season. So all of those decisions, and these are just like brief overview, they go much more in depth than that. But all of those decisions on top of now we're introducing more climate focused decisions as well. And again, climate smart practices are not necessarily new to farming operations. There's many farms who have been doing reduced tillage and cover crops and other things for years and years and years. But there's definitely been an increased focus in the last handful of years. And so some of these decisions, just to give you kind of an idea of what decisions farmers are having to look at focused on climate. First off that I wanted to talk about was tillage reduction. So a farmer, are they coming from a conventional tillage system where they're tilling their land completely and they're wanting to maybe reduce? So how reduced do they want to get? Do they want to just reduce tillage, or do they want to eliminate tillage altogether and go to like a no tillage type of system? Another question for farmers to consider in the tillage realm is really looking at, okay, if I'm going to reduce my tillage, can I use my current equipment and just do some work on it, do some retrofitting to use the same piece of equipment, but do less tillage with it? Or do I need to sell that piece of equipment and buy an entirely different piece of equipment to do the reduction of tillage? There are pros and cons to both, but I think the ultimate question there is, is my current piece of equipment even able to do that? Or also looking at how expensive is that switch going to be? Another climate-focused decision for farms to really look at is in this area of nutrient management and drainage management. So looking at, what am I applying for fertilizer? Am I using maybe some sort of commercial or a synthetic fertilizer, or am I applying manure onto my land? And then looking at how much am I applying? Also, we have the, do I have the ability to variable rate my fertilizer? So rather than having a flat rate across my entire field, am I able to use less fertilizer in certain portions of a field in order to save on how much of that fertilizer I'm actually applying? Also looking at, like, what is the condition of some of my tile intakes? So I'm really focusing on better water management. Do I have buffer strips if I'm needing them, or should I have them? And then for any of our livestock producers, how am I managing my manure handling and my manure storage? Also, if I'm applying manure to my fields, how am I getting that done? So lots on that realm. And then entering into the cover crop world, a whole new slew of questions here. So some of these are simple or more simple decisions when looking at cover crops. So the more simple would be like, what type of cover crop do I want to plant? There are a bunch of different varieties or species of cover crops that I can choose from. What do I want to plant, and at what population, or how many pounds per acre am I wanting to put on of that cover crop seed? That's a little bit of a simpler decision. However, it can get very complicated very quickly when looking at how to apply my cover crops. Generally, cover crops are planted in the fall. And so at this point, they could be planted while I still have a crop growing in my field. So for example, maybe I have corn out in my field growing, and I could hire an airplane to fly over that cornfield and apply that seed. Or would it work better to harvest my corn and then go in and just plant like I normally would plant other crops? Pros and cons to all of those options. Generally, like an aerial application with an airplane is going to be more expensive than actually planting it. However, the earlier you can plant the cover crop, the better established it will be throughout the fall, especially here in Minnesota before we hit a freeze. So again, pros and cons to both of those. The other thing to consider with cover crops too is oftentimes cover crops are planted in the fall and then harvested or terminated in the spring. What are farmers busy doing in the fall? Harvesting their commodity crops, right? And in the spring, they're busy planting their commodity crops. And so cover crops are adding into a time when farmers are already pretty busy and spread really thin. And so there are many farms who are doing cover crops, I think, very successfully. But especially for a farm who is not involved in the cover crop world, to enter into it, it's just there's all of these variables that are adding into that decision. We also have decisions based on carbon markets or around carbon markets. I think that will be a webinar here coming up in a few weeks, but just a lot of question marks around like, what are carbon markets? What is a CI score? Are there programs out there that I should be enrolling in, or what should I not be enrolling in? And just a lot of question marks there for farms. And then lastly, looking at what available cost share programs are there for these practices. So for reduced tillage or cover crops or whatever, I think there's a ton of opportunities for farms to get involved in cost share programs, whether they're government or private sourced funding. However, at the same time, while there's a huge opportunity, that can also be confusing and overwhelming because there's so many options. You know, am I going to use my soil water conservation district or EQIP or some sort of private funding or whatever that might be? It's just a lot for farmers to look at, or can be. So all of those while also considering, okay, are these decisions going to be sustainable for my farm long term? Like maybe I can commit to doing it this year, but how is it going to work next year and the year after that and 10 years down the road? Is this something I can implement long term? Also looking at how will this impact my farm's profitability? Do I have the actual capacity in terms of people, so both labor and my management capacity to handle this, again, both this year, but also long term and down the road? While also keeping in mind that I think farmers in general do really care about the land and want to be good stewards. So trying to look at, okay, what I'm currently doing is, am I being a good steward of the land? And how will these practices help me improve what I'm already doing? So just a few final closing remarks. First off, like I said, farmers do really want to be good stewards of their land. They're pretty well aware that what they put into the land is what they can get out. So obviously taking care of their land is going to help their yields, but also help their land to be productive, you know, both in the short term and the long term. At the same time, farmers are businesses, and so it's really important that they are profitable, both short and long term. So making sure they're making decisions that are going to help with land stewardship and profitability at the same time. Also, it's a lot easier for farms to invest when financial times are good, right? If I have a little extra cash, I'm maybe more willing to invest in some new practices on my farm versus when times are tight, it's going to be harder. We're entering into a time where commodity prices, especially for grain, are really low right now. And so, again, it might be a little bit harder for farms in the next handful of weeks, months, years, whoever knows how long, to invest in some of those practices. Farmers definitely prefer a let's work together mindset rather than kind of being told what they need to do. And so as much as we can include farms in any solution discussion, so whether we're coming from government mentality or private sector, really including farms in the discussion, I think is a really positive way to move forward. And last but not least, there's so many options, I think, available right now, so many opportunities for farms, but it can be overwhelming. So really, as much as we can like break down and make readily available information to farms, the better. With that, I'm going to hand things back over to Michael.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Again, a huge amount of information there. Thank you very much. Next, we are going to shift over to Ariel Kagan. And I will hand things over to you, Ariel.
Great, thanks, Michael. Well, this is a good conversation to be a part of. And what Katie was just talking about is very well aligned with, you know, the conversations that I'm in frequently about how do we actually make climate smart markets work for farmers. I'm actually in Arkansas right now at a conference that's all about this topic and just came off of a morning session all about developing markets for climate smart commodities. So very timely. So I'm Ariel Kagan. I lead our Climate and Working Lands program at Minnesota Farmers Union. Minnesota Farmers Union is a general farm organization representing family farmers across the state of Minnesota. We're grassroots. Our members set our policy, and they do that through their county conventions where they get together and talk about things that are important to them. And over the past many years, climate resilience has been a key priority for our members, and that's what led to the creation of this program, looking at climate and working lands. And a lot of what we focus on is market development. How are these new opportunities working for farmers, and how can we develop maybe policy, either through our public policy process or working with companies that make sure that farmers have real opportunities to grow their businesses and do what's right by the land. So, I think what's important to think about with climate smart markets is that it's not just one thing. I think carbon markets have gotten a lot of attention over the past many years, and it's an important part of this, but that's just one version of what a climate smart market can mean for agriculture. So there are multiple ways for farmers to be rewarded for the practices that they're doing on their land that have climate benefits. What's challenging is that this market is emerging very quickly and the rules are still being written. So many of the different market channels are voluntary and have some rules maybe through nonprofits that have created guidelines or structures, frameworks that sort of guide how carbon markets or in-setting programs work. And some of the rules are through new tax credits and through legal requirements of different states. So it's challenging to figure out really what the rules of the road are for each specific market. I think we're in a point in time where the private sector frameworks have been guiding a lot of this action over the past many years, really since, I would say since 2017, many of the private companies have sort of stepped into a role of looking how to reduce their climate impacts in their supply chains. And so they've developed pretty robust frameworks about how to do that and how to account for the greenhouse gas inventories of their companies. But now we're in a time where public investments, especially through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly in Minnesota, we have a lot of state investments and our climate action framework are creating new opportunities for farmers and for these markets, and also a little bit of chaos because they aren't all necessarily lining up perfectly as we all learn and develop these new pathways together. So I sort of think about 5 different tracks for how farmers can be paid for what they're doing to improve climate resilience and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I always like to start out by thinking about direct marketing or identity preserved. I think these are sort of often left out of the conversation, but things like farmers markets, organic labeled food, direct marketing, quarter cow or half a hog to your neighbors. A lot of those markets have to do with the relationship between your buyer and your seller and the environmental attributes that go along with that. So I know I bought a quarter cow from a farmer who manages her land in a way that really resonates with me, and I wanted to make that investment. And for me, somebody who lives in the city, it wasn't just buying a quarter cow, which is quite a big amount of both money and meat, but also had to buy a deep freeze, right? So I was really committed to that relationship. I've since bought additional meat from her, and that's important to me because it supports what she's doing with her land. So that's, I think, an important channel. And there's also, for a lot of the companies that AURI works with, thinking about smaller food companies, CPG companies that might be at a scale where they can work directly with a farmer doing interesting, important work on their land, and then turn those into value-added products, whether it's, cereal or other, salsas and things like that, that then can speak directly to consumers and maintain that story. So I think that's one really important part of all of this climate smart market work that's happening. Traditional government conservation programs are both available and familiar to many farmers, and also now growing. So the Inflation Reduction Act included an additional $20 billion for climate smart practices through traditional USDA conservation programs like EQIP and CSP. We also have a wide variety of programs at the state level through soil and water conservation districts, the Department of Agriculture, that are investing in soil health, climate smart farming practices. And so I think that's also a way that farmers can receive a payment for what they're doing in a different way. And then there is the carbon offset market and supply chain programs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. And then the whole world of clean fuels, which is rapidly developing, and there's a lot of excitement around. So this is just showing the traditional government conservation programs and that additional funding from the Inflation Reduction Act over the next few years. So we've already seen the first couple of years of funding go out through these dollars, and they're focused on high value practices that have climate benefits: cover crops, nutrient management, reduced tillage. There's a list that the USDA updates of which practices are eligible for these funds. And it's really important because in the state of Minnesota, for example, only about 30% of the applications for EQIP, for example, are funded because of a lack of resources. And so our farmers in Minnesota are very interested in implementing these practices, and these additional monies will help them reach those goals. I also want to mention the MDA Soil Health Financial Assistance Grants, which are currently open for applications. And that's a great program that helps farmers buy equipment that will help them implement soil health practices on their farm. SWCD programs, as I said, are fantastic, and many others that are around the state. So supply chain programs, I think, are really interesting because they're a little less seen than carbon markets. So supply chain programs are really focused on companies that have made a public commitment to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and then have started the process of figuring out how to operationalize that commitment. And so, you know, about half of the world's largest companies have now made those public commitments. These commitments are in line with the Paris Agreement, which is to keep total warming less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do that, we need to reduce emissions by a certain amount by 2030 and another target by 2050. And so there are these third-party entities, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science Based Targets Initiative, that help companies to assess their greenhouse gas inventory. So what are they responsible for in their operations and their supply chain? And then how do they start reducing in line with these targets that they've set for 2030 and 2050? And this is what's driving a lot of the biggest companies: General Mills, PepsiCo, Target, you know, Cargill, like, you know, I mean, Minnesota has a wealth of Fortune 500 companies, and most of them have science-based targets related to this. And that's what's driving them to look at their supply chains and really think about how they can make changes that will reduce that inventory along those targets. You can actually go to the Science Based Targets website and look at every company that made one of these commitments and what their plan is to reduce emissions. So a little bit deeper into that, when you're looking at corporate accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, companies are looking across 3 scopes of emissions. And the first scope is the emissions that the company itself owns. So if you imagine a factory that has a smoke pipe, the emissions coming out of that pipe based on the manufacturing of the goods that they're creating, that's their scope 1 emissions. And so you can address those through improving efficiencies at the plant. You can you know, change out your product perhaps to reduce emissions. That's, you know, scope 1 is in your control, things that you own. Scope 2 has to do with the energy you buy to run your operation. So, you know, the lights at the factory or at the office, and what's powering that. And so that's where you see a lot of activity with, for example, power purchase agreements with utilities, where a company will say, you know, we want to co-invest in a renewable project so that we can reduce our scope 2 emissions of the electricity we're using. But where agriculture really fits is in scope 3. And this is all of the indirect emissions that a company is responsible for with their product and has to think about reducing. And it's hard because they don't necessarily control all of the parts of the supply chain that affect their scope 3 emissions, but they have to consider it in their inventory and their accounting. So for example, a bottle of Pepsi would have corn syrup that comes from, you know, from a field of corn. And so they need to consider what's the carbon emissions associated with growing the corn, with harvesting the corn, with processing the corn into corn syrup, with transporting that corn syrup to a Pepsi factory and turning it into a bottle of Pepsi. And then they also have to consider all of the sort of next stage of consumption. So you know, sending that to a store where it's bought. And then what happens with that plastic bottle at the end of its life cycle? Does it go in a landfill? What's the emissions associated with that? So it's a very complex accounting requirement for these companies. And there are all sorts of tools that help them do this. But one of the hardest areas to account for is the corn in the cornfield that is going to get turned into the product. And so that is where a lot of these climate smart commodity projects are then focused on, is reducing emissions in field so that they can have a positive impact on scope 3 accounting through the supply chain. So here's some examples of what's going on in that world. You can see grown climate smart labels on some products that are coming through. Most of this is behind the label. You're not seeing it because it's just happening sort of in the supply chain. I do want to mention on carbon markets, Minnesota Farmers Union put together a farmer's guide to carbon market contracts in Minnesota that goes through a lot of the details about carbon markets and what they mean, how to assess them, and what some of these terms like additionality and double dipping are. And it's a great resource and available on our website. Some of the ways that carbon credits are used are primarily outside of the food and ag space. So Microsoft, for example, is a big buyer of carbon credits to offset their scope 1 emissions. I put this just because of the interest of this group in packaged food goods. Neutral is a milk company that was just launched that is very much putting climate change on the front of their package. Literally, this milk fights climate change. And the way that they're doing that is they're working both with their scope 3 emissions and dairy farmers to reduce the emissions on dairy farms, but they know that to start marketing right away, they need to just buy offsets to get to carbon neutral, and so that they can start selling while they're continuing to work on their supply chain. And then carbon intensity and fuel markets are a huge point of discussion. So the Inflation Reduction Act included tax credit, many tax credits, but one in particular, 45Z for clean fuel production. And that's based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. That includes many things, but for us, it's particularly interesting because of the feedstock, the corn or the soy that gets turned into the biofuel, and how can we reduce the carbon intensity to generate value through this tax credit. This is also related to sustainable aviation fuel, which is exciting and getting lots of attention in Minnesota for sure. And low carbon fuel standards around the country that at this point don't include a feedstock component, but may in the future as more states adopt that policy. And then two other things just to share, what are we doing at MFU? We're certainly engaging in all of these conversations and representing our members as these markets develop, like I said at the beginning, but we also have a Co-ops for Climate grant program where we're funding farmer cooperatives to engage in climate solutions. So Perennial Promise Growers Cooperative is one that we have helped to fund that are doing some really interesting work around perennial crops. We're also very supportive of the work happening at University of Minnesota Morris and the West Central Research and Outreach Station there on green fertilizer and how that can help decarbonize agriculture broadly, and developing farmer leadership on climate change. And one piece that we're excited about that I'll share is that we're hiring right now for a Climate Corps service member. So this is an AmeriCorps position, very exciting, again, funded through Inflation Reduction Act dollars. It will be a position that will work with my team on implementing climate smart agriculture with our members and thinking about, broadly how farmers can be part of the solution. So I think that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ariel. So kind of to keep the conversation going here, I've got a question for Pete. So has there been an adjustment in weather forecasting over the past 10 years with all of the variability that you're seeing?
There's forecasts and there's outlooks. So if you're talking like forecasts, that's what you see on TV at night. And, I don't know if there's been, obviously there's been improvements over time with forecasts. They're getting more accurate in the next couple of days. If you're talking outlooks, what's interesting about that is what they're taking into account are those weather trends now in the outlooks, like a year out. We're looking at next summer, something like that, or next winter. So the fact that we had equal chances for temperature over much of Minnesota this winter is already factoring in a climate trend over time of a warming winter. So it's counterbalancing the La Nina, which would typically cool us. So it kind of balances each other out. So they are, yes, absolutely, they are trying to be smart outlook prognosticators to include trends in their climate, if that's the question.
Yep. Thank you, Pete. And a question for you, Katie. You offered a lot of different options and decision-making pivots that producers have to take into consideration. Are you seeing one area over others that producers are seeking more information or more interest in?
I think it's kind of about ease. What's the like easiest first step? You know, how can I baby step into it? And so definitely looking at reduced tillage is almost like the next step for a farm who's maybe not doing really any climate smart practices at all. Tillage seems to be a lot easier for farmers to get into versus cover crops. There's just a lot more logistics to figure out. So it tends to be kind of like tillage first and then getting into the cover crops. Something else that we see too a lot is farmers don't tend to do all of their land all at once to all of this stuff. Rather, like, okay, how can I start with maybe just one field or a portion of a field and kind of ease into it that way, like get the management figured out on a portion of my acres and then spread it across the farm.
There. And Ariel, you were talking about the different scopes and the larger corporations. Are you seeing not necessarily larger corporations, but smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses, smaller businesses that are looking and shifting into the climate smart arena?
Yeah, I think that for the big companies, it's really a lot of people say, and it's sort of true to a certain extent, but I don't totally agree, that a lot of this is being driven by consumer demand. And I think, there's some of that, but also a lot of consumers are not putting climate change at the top of their priority list when they're at the grocery store. And so for the big companies, a lot of what's driving the climate smart imperative is the CEO and the leadership at that company. It's the shareholders who are concerned both about reputational risk as well as resilience in supply chains and building, more climate smart, climate resilient businesses in the long run as shareholders. And it's also the employees. So these big companies are finding that it's easier to recruit and retain younger talent who are interested in working for places that have climate commitments. On the smaller side, I think that's where consumers really have a lot of relationship with brands that are doing interesting things, and it may not have to do with greenhouse gas accounting as much as it is about the story that a food brand is telling to their customers. So, I think we see a lot of those startup food companies that are entirely focused on regenerative agriculture as a part of their brand from the big, it may be a consumer who, like me, buys both Cheetos at a grocery store as a snack, and also goes to the farmer's market and really wants to buy sustainably grown tomatoes. And I'm the same person, but I have multitude of different consumer habits. So I think there's opportunity at every scale to participate in these markets, but in different ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, Dan, do you have any questions from the audience?
We don't have any from the audience, but I've percolated a couple myself, especially when you got a weatherman on the show. We all want a moment with the weatherman, don't we? Pete, I just want to circle back to you. Who's coming to you requesting climate data, and what are they asking for? And are you seeing them incorporated into the
I missed the last part of what you said there, Dan. But who is looking for climate data? Pretty much, weather impacts everybody. So we get across the spectrum people looking for information. There are certain products that people want to do for their water balancing. When to irrigate, that's always a big deal. And so there's programs out there. So there's certain elements you want to collect. And one thing that's expanding across the state, people might have heard of NDAWN. That's the North Dakota Agricultural Weather Network, is expanding into Minnesota, into the agricultural areas, and that's geared for the farmer. And they have elements that aren't really collected very well in the state right now. Everybody wants solar radiation data. And that's something that isn't very common yet. And that's one of those key elements you need. How sunny is it? That matters, and how much water evaporation off the ground. So what we're hoping to get over time is better evapotranspiration, that ET measurement everybody wants. And eventually, probably next year, we'll be in a better shape for that. So there are new things coming out that people are looking for. So we get requests, how come you don't have this? How come you don't have that? And that helps us because then we know what people want. Sometimes on the web, people grab our products, but we don't really know, what are they really looking for? But, we start to get what's missing from our products, and then that helps gear for the future. If that helps out what you're looking for.
We do have a question from one of our participants today, and I don't know, Ariel or Katie, either one can take it. Does this group recommend regenerative farming despite the fact that animals are being slaughtered?
Katie, I don't know, I can jump in. So regenerative agriculture, is a term that has there's no federal definition about what regenerative agriculture is, but many different organizations and companies have a definition of regenerative agriculture that is, it has similar principles. And so some of those principles are soil health, keeping the soil covered, having a living root in the soil, so that's cover crops. Keeping the soil covered is reduced tillage. And a really key part of many of these definitions is integrating livestock on the land. In the upper Midwest, we're a prairie ecosystem, and our plants and animals co-evolved with bison, with herd animals. And there's a really important relationship between soil health and plant health, and having ruminants, especially on the land. And so there are many companies that are using livestock, including reintroducing bison into parts of the Midwest landscape, and then, improving soil health through that. It's a really interesting process. So, I'm very excited about the idea that livestock can be a part of this system. I think there's ways to support smaller farmers that have less land. It's easier sometimes to start a small livestock operation on marginal land than a large row crop.
Katie, you're nodding in agreement. Is that kind of what you're hearing in your office as well?
Yeah, and the other piece too, we looking at like the profitability side of things, it's a lot easier to generate profit, especially when we're talking about cover crops, when we're integrating livestock into that, because so a cover crop essentially is planted in the fall and terminated or harvested in the spring. A lot of farms, if they don't have livestock, they just terminate that cover crop. So they don't necessarily have a use for it. But if farms have livestock, they can harvest that cover crop or put animals out for grazing. So they're able to get some like production value out of it rather than just, spraying it off or whatever that might be. So it's helpful on the profitability side of things too.
When we talk about opportunities for value-added agriculture, we have a person who was asked the question, what if anything is being, are you hearing about crop insurance rates due to the climate change or the change to more cover crops? Is it affecting, and maybe Pete, maybe you're collecting data for insurance companies. I don't know who wants to take that one on, but are we seeing changes because of climate change on how we insure these crops and whether or not we use cover crops?
Well, my quick answer is we're not involved at all in the insurance company. What they do is off on their own. We're just the weather people here.
Ariel?
Ariel, you might have a better answer. I think there are certain states where crop insurance is impacted by like cover crops and stuff like that. I don't believe Minnesota has gotten onto that bandwagon yet. So not here in Minnesota, where I probably have more expertise, but I don't know, Ariel, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, so federal crop insurance is a farm bill program, so it comes through the federal government, and it's one of the most complex systems, and it's not very responsive to immediate changes in the insurance market because of the way it's subsidized and set up through USDA's risk management agency. But some of the things we have been seeing, certainly there's an interest in understanding the impact of conservation practices on crop insurance claims. We've also seen some pilots through investments over the past couple of years. Like Iowa, for example, piloted a cover crop premium reduction of $5 an acre if you had cover crops, and that was very successful, and that is now being proposed federally for the farm bill. Of course, we're still waiting for a farm bill. And we're seeing increasing cover crop crop insurance claims because of weather-related disasters and prevent plant acres and things like this. And so I think we will continue to have this conversation about maintaining a very strong safety net for farmers at the same time that we're thinking about how do we integrate some of the things we're learning about conservation practices and resilience.
Katie, the significant increase in the growing season now favors the new cover crop argument. But farmers are still traditionalists, and they don't always think about making that transition to something new. How have these climate trends changed your education to farmers when they're trying to do a good farm plan?
The climate change does favor cover crops, but it still is going to vary significantly based on where in the US you are. I would say, like, yes, the growing season is getting longer, but it's still probably a lot easier to implement a cover crop system in Illinois than Minnesota, just based on the weather, and even southern Minnesota versus northern Minnesota. So yes, it is favoring that, but it's still, I think farmers are still wanting to use up those growing degree days with their commodity crop as much as they can. And so a lot of them are probably taking more advantage of how do I get longer or more days with my commodity crop rather than filling in a cover crop. But, yeah, just helping them, again, really analyze that, like, how is the best way to plant a cover crop and when. Obviously, the earlier you can get a cover crop on, the more established it will be in the fall before freezing hits, which is a huge issue here in Minnesota. However, yet, like, no matter when freezing happens, in the spring, it's also a great opportunity. Cover crops have a great opportunity to grow. So really helping farmers just think through, like, timing of when to plant and terminate.
We're nearing the end of our time here, but Ariel or Katie, I'll throw this one out for you guys too. Do you see the potential to treat the MAWQCP participants, I think that's the water quality participants, as a cohort to introduce ever more earth-friendly and lower CO2 practices? Ariel, I see you nodding.
Yes, yeah. The Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program, MACWIP, or however you want to say it, is a great program. Over 1 million acres enrolled now across the state. And that is a cohort of farmers who are doing interesting things on their land, and certainly, farm business management, and I believe the Center for Farm Financial Management has been doing research on the profitability of those farms and how those the sort of environmental cohort is performing, and it always performs very well compared to the baseline. So I think it's a great group. There's commodity groups are working with those producers to market those products internationally and elsewhere. So big opportunity, great model for other states too. It's a great program.
Yeah, and I just would feed off that. I think it's definitely a possibility, a great potential. I'm all about data collection and how accurate is all of that. Like, are we entering everything the same way, just to make sure that all of the results, from one farm to another, are they different because of data entry differences, or are they different because of the actual farm differences? So I think it's a great opportunity as long as we could figure out a way to, ensure, like, the accuracy of both data entry and outflow.
Michael Sparby, I'm going to go to you, and then I've got a last one for Pete as well. Michael, 20 years with AURI, helping entrepreneurs come forward with their ideas. Are you seeing that they are considering opportunities around climate change, or are they still just developing new ideas and practices that they want to try to bring to market?
I would definitely say they're taking that into consideration when they're looking at new products and essentially new markets for their products. Especially when you take a look at co-ops. I think you're seeing that moving forward on multiple levels. So everything from the crop and livestock side of it.
And Pete, we did have a question from someone on staff that was wondering if you're seeing variations, obviously, in Minnesota and the upper Midwest. Are they similar in around the United States or around the world, or is there trends in certain places that are different?
The quick answer to that is, where is the snow cover? So think about how snow cover operates. You lose your snow cover, you're going to warm up quicker, and that's why you'll see more of an impact in temperatures in the northern part of the country. Quick answer.
And I'm going to go around the table real quick, and Ariel, we'll start with you, and just give us one or two sentences about opportunities in agriculture through climate change. What do you see in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, well, I want to emphasize that, I don't think that climate smart is the new kale chips. I don't think this is a passing fad. We're seeing huge investment from the private sector, from governments in this space, and agriculture has a huge role to play as a climate solution. So I think we will be seeing opportunities over the next 10 to 15 years in this space. I think that's really important. And there's so many different ways to do it. So it's not just one thing. It's not just carbon markets. It's not just cover crops. And so it's a really good opportunity for both farmers to figure out what their goals are and how they want to engage in this, and for businesses to think about how they also want to do that.
Katie, how would you respond?
I would say, looking at really the farm perspective and opportunities for farmers, I think time will tell as we are able to gather more data and more information really specific to like farm profitability and how these things are impacting, yields and stuff like that. But I think currently there's a lot of opportunity for cost increases and cost decreases both on the farm, and that's where time will tell to see what outweighs the other. So cost increases would include things like cover crop seed. I'm adding more seed expense into my farm, or termination or stuff like that. So the biggest question mark is going to be, how do those costs, how offset are they by the potential impacts? So can cover crops have an impact on increasing commodity crop yields? Can they help me as a farmer decrease the amount of fertilizer I have to apply, or decrease the amount of chemicals I have to apply due to weed management and stuff like that? So I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes as we collect more data on some of those things, but definitely opportunities, as Ariel was saying, with various cost share programs and stuff like that. But then also looking just on the farm, are we able to reduce some of my normal operating costs from some of these climate smart practices?
Peter, what do you see as opportunities through climate change?
Sure. Well, I'm always looking for more weather watchers. Farmers are our best weather observers we have. They always have been. And Southwest Minnesota, we're looking for people to watch the weather. So if anybody's interested, look me up.
And Michael Sparby, what do you want to leave us with today?
Well, I think you take a look at the cover crop conversation. I think there's a lot of opportunity into the future. AUI working with the University of Minnesota and the Forever Green program. The key is being able to find value for the producer with that cover crop. Is that going to be a bottom line asset? I think if it is, you're going to see adoption a lot easier.
And that concludes AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday for today. I want to thank Michael Sparby, Peter Boulay, Katie Wiltz-Johnson, and Ariel Kagan for their time today. AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday is presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota and is sponsored by Bremer Bank and Avisen Legal. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. We're interested in your feedback, so please respond when we send you our event evaluations. And remember, for more information on today's program or any of the work that AURI is involved in, you can go to auri.org. This was part one of a four-part series. In the future, we plan to take a deeper dive into value-added agricultural opportunities in carbon, water resources, and nitrogen. Join us on Wednesday, September 11th for part two in this series when we discuss carbon as an asset. Remember, you can always learn more about our work at by going to auri.org.